Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Well, June is Pride Month, and all this month, Bloomberg Businessweek will feature voices on topics related to equality. And to that end, Carol, we've got a great guest with us. Sarah Kate Ellis is president and CEO of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, more commonly known as GLAAD. GLAAD describes itself as a, quote, nonprofit organization focused on LGBTQ advocacy and cultural change. Sarah Kate joins us from New York.
Sarah Kate, so great to have you here with us. One of the things I wanted to kind of kick off with, you've been in this position for 10 years, and I am curious, what you have seen in terms of the hope, the disappointments, the enlightenments, the reality, in terms of acknowledgement and acceptance of the LGBTQ community. Because like most paths, it's never a straight line up or down.
Well, thank you for having me. Happy Pride. And that's a great question. It has been a roller coaster ride for the past 10 years. Before I started, we were headed into, and really did have the winds at our back at that point, on marriage equality. And then we saw a real sharp backlash to that. So what we do at GLAAD is we do an annual KPI or measurement tool that we have called Accelerating Acceptance. And it's a piece of research that measures culture and society to understand how accepting or not accepting it is for LGBTQ people in America. And what we've seen is that it's moved, once we passed marriage equality, we really saw a jump in acceptance in America. But then once we saw the 2016 election, we saw it dip down acceptance for LGBTQ Americans. And ever since, we've seen it continually dip down as opposed to increase. However, what we haven't seen change and has stayed the same and is incredibly powerful for the past 10 years is that over 90% of Americans believe in equality and acceptance for the LGBTQ community. So we haven't seen that ebb flow, but we have seen culture ebb and flow over the past 10 years.
Sarah Kate, are you surprised that it hasn't been more linear?
I think, honestly, after marriage equality, we really felt like, wow, we're making so much progress. The wind is at our backs, like I said. So it was shocking, honestly. But when you look at change in the trajectory and over long periods of time, it does ebb and flow. So I shouldn't have been surprised, but I really got caught up, honestly, in the power of progress that was happening at that time. And it was palpable in the culture acceptance for the LGBTQ community. And my wife and I were able to get married. Mm-hmm. Our kids were at our wedding, so it felt so good. Felt as though we were finally making headway, and we have made tremendous headway, but we have seen a backlash.
All right. So we have made headway, as you said, 90% of Americans' acceptance of the LGBTQ community. Why then, and you shared this statistics with a statistic with our producer, Paul Brennan, why are then we seeing 500 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in 2024 if there's such a high acceptance level? I mean, I think about all the political polling. There's nothing, it feels like, that's 90%, and yet there's all this anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced. Why is that?
Well, I think it's the continued disconnect between a handful of politicians and the American will and want, right? It's not, a lot of politicians today don't actually stand up for the majority of Americans and where they see America going. So this is a handful of politicians who are vehemently anti-LGBTQ. And these bills have been sweeping across America. Now, the great news is that I think out of the 500, 37 have passed, which is not a lot. Unless you live in that state, and then it's life changing for you. But the damage is done when they're proposed. And that's why we're seeing the backslide in acceptance, because these bills are defining who we are as an LGBTQ community, because they're being talked about in the news media by anti-LGBTQ politicians. And they're especially targeting the transgender and gender nonconforming communities. And that's super dangerous because it's a small community within our community. They don't have a big voice. And that's why so many of us in the community are using, whenever we get a chance to talk about it, are talking about the trans and gender nonconforming community, because they've been politically used by anti-LGBTQ political activists.
Sarah Kate, one thing that's been really surprising to me, and we're Bloomberg, so we go, companies is the, and economics and business is the lens that we look through so frequently, is what's happened with companies that seemed like they were, that they had fully accepted the idea of selling pride merchandise. I'm talking about Target, for example. It's now walking this tightrope because of fear they could face backlash like they did last year. Bud Light, I mean, we don't even have to rehash what happened there. That pushback was so surprising to me. What's going on in the corporate world right now from your view?
So there are, thank you for bringing this up, because I think there's a lot of false narratives around this. So I want to say that a couple of things. One is that what I've seen out of last year, yes, Bud Light, and Target were targeted by a handful of anti-LGBTQ activists that did an outsized social media campaign, and it did cause it caused some issues in the marketplace. Any CEO I talk to, and if you look at the latest Gravity research, the majority of corporate executives and Fortune 500 leaders are not backing down from their pride strategy, or what they are doing, and this is something that we've always asked for, and Target is doing this, is actually making it Pride 365 and not putting all their eggs in one pride basket, so to speak. Brands are really stepping up. They're not stepping down. And I'll tell you why. The reason is because CEOs and boards know that 30% of Gen Z are LGBTQ. And 80% are allies. And they're not just allies for the sake of allies. They are very active allies. And so the future generation of employees and of consumers are highly attuned to the LGBTQ community. And in order to appeal to them, you have to stand up for the community. So we work with over 200 brands at GLAAD, and none of them have been backing down. So I think that there was a lot of headlines at that moment in time, but nobody really dug into the story. And when you look at the story, we haven't seen a movement from Fortune 500 companies.
One thing I wanted to ask you, it's like, we do months, right, to celebrate different parts of our community. And I kind of am with you that I feel like it's got to be embedded, intrinsic. It's got to be 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Like our thinking, it's not just we did a day, a month, and we've solved our problems, or now everybody understands. It's really so much more than that. Fair?
Definitely. Absolutely. I think we can have days, weeks, months, whatever it is, because we're talking about marginalized communities. The reason we dedicate some time to these folks is because they have unequally been left out of conversations. And so we're trying to bring their voice to the table in various different ways. And the true authentic way to do that, like you said, is by incorporating, whether it be women or LGBTQ people or people of color, 365 days in every facet of your business. And that's the future of this country and the future of business.
Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec, live here on Bloomberg Businessweek. We want to get back to our guest. We're talking with Sarah Kate Ellis. She is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, more commonly known as GLAAD, still with us right here in New York City. Sarah Kate, one of the things that Tim and I wanted to talk to you about, and we kind of went back, harkened to a conversation we had with our own Michael McKee, who follows policy economics on a global scale, but how media has amplified the pain of inflation. And it plays out in kind of political polling, if you will, that people just feel so bad about everything, but it kind of exacerbates things. You have certainly, played a role in media in terms of for the LGBTQ community and being aware of it. And I am curious how media has either helped or hurt in terms of acceptance and understanding by the broader public.
Media is everywhere, right? And people have platforms that have never had platforms before. And I think it is, it's both a curse and a blessing. We've seen media really accelerate acceptance for the LGBTQ community. President Biden once said that Will and Grace did more for marriage equality than anything else. And I think
do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of when you're thinking about folks who don't know LGBTQ people and opening hearts and minds, coming into your personal living, at that time it was like on TVs, you didn't have phones, coming into your personal living room or your personal space and laughing with you and crying with you. There's nothing that replaces that to move hearts and minds and to humanize people. And it's quite frankly, we're running 3 ad campaigns right now. And because we understand that only 30% of Americans know someone who's trans. So the rest of the 70% of people in America are learning about transgender people through media. Wow. And right now it's all those bad bills. So we have this Here We Are Now campaign. We have Protect This Kid campaign. We have all these media campaigns that we're running to introduce people in America to trans folks and humanize them. So it works. I think it works really efficiently and effectively to open hearts and minds.
Well, it's interesting you say that because Tim and I were talking before we got started, and I certainly have members of my extended family. I have really good friends that are members of the LGBTQ community, and it's an education, but it's also, they're living and loving life just like everybody else. And so it's for me, it's been a big education, but I just think, and I do wonder how that impacts certainly the world more broadly, that if you have that experience, I don't know, you're more accepting versus maybe if you don't. I don't know.
Well, Sarah Kate, that actually brings up a good point, and it's the idea that we're not talking about a monolith here. And I'm wondering if what we're seeing right now in terms of what we were describing earlier with the path to progress not being linear, are we seeing more resistance to the trans part of LGBTQ right now than the lesbian and gay part of it?
I would say categorically yes. And that's because 90% of Americans say they know someone who's lesbian or gay. And only 30%, as I said, more Americans report seeing a ghost than knowing a trans person. And so what you don't know, you
Wait,
hear.
Say that again, because that's cray-cray. Say that again.
30% of Americans say they know someone who's trans. More Americans say they've seen a ghost than know a trans person.
I'm sorry for making you do that. It's just sometimes we need to hear that.
No,
continue.
I don't think you believe in ghosts, Carol.
Enlightening, right?
Yeah.
It is. It's enlightening. It is. And so I do think that because people don't know trans people, that they are being targeted, and they're definitely being targeted by politicians. Most of those 500 anti-LGBTQ bills that you spoke of earlier are targeting the trans community. And for no good reason. Trans people have always been here. They have gained, and this is a little bit of what you were asking about too, they have gained more visibility than ever before, the trans community. And with that visibility comes fear because people don't know who they are. They're trying to understand. But once you know someone, once you know someone's story, once you meet somebody, it's really hard to hate them.
How do you think about the investment universe, our world, that we talk about so much? Money can bring attention to something, can move the needles on things. The investing world can too. So I'm curious how you think about that, if there's something to connect there or not.
Well, I think about our disposable income, right? As a community is, I think, 1.1 trillion. And I think about companies understand, a lot of times it used to be called the pink dollar. I think companies understand that there is a lot of opportunity with the LGBTQ community on every level, in investment, in consumer goods, in all of it. And so I think that helps our community along the way, because from early on, our community has been positioned mainly because the people at the forefront of our community that had their platforms were gay white men. And they could oftentimes hide who they were in the workplace and rise into great positions that enabled them to have quite a bit of income. And that has been very helpful for our community in building our economic power and political power.
Sarah Kate, we only have about 20 seconds left, 30 seconds. What's the conversation you and I are having with Carol 5 years from now?
I think we're going to see a great acceptance. We're going to see 70% of Americans know someone who's trans versus 30%. And we're going to have a more accepting, kinder society. I know we have to get there. And I know that we're in a little bit of a culture war now, but I think on the other side of it, we're all about moving forward, building, dreaming. And that is about tomorrow.
It's funny.
Love that.
I didn't hear people introduce themselves with pronouns until I went to my little brother's college graduation to show, and I'm 40.
Yeah.
It wasn't done when I was in college.
Yeah.
Like, things have changed quickly.
Yeah, there's been a lot that has actually happened, I feel like, in the last couple of years. You left us with some hope heading into the weekend, and I really, really appreciate that. I think our audience does too. Sarah Kate, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Sarah Kate Ellis, she's President and Chief Executive Officer of GLAAD, joining us here in New York City. Yeah, I love that, right? Change does happen. Right? And if you think about it, right, the pronouns was a great example of, right, we weren't talking about it.
Wasn't even on my radar, I should say.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Businessweek, and this is Bloomberg.